The crisis in Ukraine leapt most recently into international attention with the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 on July 17, 2014. Not only were all 283 passengers killed, the recovery of the bodies and the investigation into the crash were hampered by ongoing hostilities and a lack of cooperation among local forces. Accusations and counter-accusations flew, a pattern that both predates this tragedy and continues today. It's been almost a year since mass protests began in November 2013 in Kiev, when President Yanukovych abandoned plans to forge closer trade ties with the EU. These protests quickly spread, propelled by harsh repressions at home and worldwide media attention. The center was located in Kiev's Independence Square, the Maidan, where pitched battles ultimately took place. The outcome included the overthrow of Yanukovych's government, followed by the public exposure of his decadent lifestyle and corruption, the release of political prisoner Yulia Tymoshenko, new elections, growing unrest in the country's east, as well as the covert and overt involvement of Russia, most prominently in the seizure and annexation of Crimea, the home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It is very easy to cast these events as a morality tale containing clear-cut heroes and villains. Yet such a plotline can obscure more than it reveals. Within the military conflict itself, both sides have committed war crimes and atrocities. Too many victims are simply civilians unable to flee. Far-right activists are claiming political legitimacy, and the Ukrainian government's usage of the language of counterterrorism to describe its military campaigns is highly unhelpful, shall we say. To be sure, Russian President Vladimir Putin certainly makes an attractive villain. Russian forces did seize Crimea, despite initial denials, and there are now numerous reports of funerals taking place in Russia of Russian soldiers mysteriously killed in Ukraine. According to news reports, Putin has recently awarded one of the highest military honors, the Order of Suvorov, to the division in question. Yet British Prime Minister David Cameron has recently warned that we should not appease Putin, evoking the specter of Hitler, the 1938 Munich Accords with its kind of misguided celebration of peace in our time, and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Equating a political leader with Hitler, a rhetorical flourish that is used much too frequently in my view, effectively reduces policy options. In this case, it encourages a return to Cold War mentalities, and at best, a policy of containment. As numerous scholars have noted, the better parallels with today's situation might actually be World War I, a war that was started more by accident than by design, due to an entire series of stupidities, misunderstandings, and delusions across all the great powers. In trying to make sense of recent events, I would like to begin with addressing another question about historical parallels. Is this crisis now developing in Ukraine, spiraling into the kind of civil conflict that tore apart the former Yugoslavia? It's a very good question. Of course, historians are not in the business of predicting the future, but we can say that such an escalation has now become a possibility, one potential path of development that depends upon a range of factors, including the often unpredictable actions of local separatists, who were likely responsible for the shooting down of the aircraft, as well as the politics and rhetoric of political leaders, both in Russia and Ukraine, as well as more broadly in the EU and the United States. It is worth emphasizing that the violence itself is a radicalizing and polarizing force, though this is a purely recent phenomenon. Russian-speaking Ukrainians had previously been in no peril whatsoever. The parallel with the former Yugoslavia or with Serbia and Kosovo is thus apt in some respects, but not others. Most fundamentally, I would say, it reminds us that we should be careful not to understand either case through the kind of simplistic visor of nationalistic terms. In other words, with the same language nationalists themselves use, often for overtly political goals. These are not somehow natural conflicts between neatly divided, clearly defined ethnic or national groups, whether Serbs and Croats or Russians and Ukrainians. Identities on the ground are very often hybrid, a mixture of the two. There have been centuries of coexistence, as much peaceful as not, in fact, much more often peaceful. And these identities do not simply map upon political views, and this is very much the case in Ukraine. You can't say because somebody is Russian speaker, they're going to support Russian. It simply is not that easy. But national categories are immensely powerful. They serve to construct and mobilize groups for political ends, as well as to reinforce deeply flawed and often harmful stereotypes. And this is among outside observers and policymakers, as well as the actual participants. So the Balkans are not a seething cauldron of nationalist impulses and innate long-standing violence, as many claimed in the 1990s. Similarly, common images of Russia, as in Winston Churchill's very famous words, a riddle wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma, only reproduce the stereotype that Russia is somehow other, alien to European values and Western civilization, even impervious to our very categories of understanding. Such assumptions have typically underpinned broader ideas about Russia's people and government. In his highly influential travelogue from 1839, for example, the Marquis de Custine described Russians as a people born to slavery. Such views remain widespread today among those who claim that Russians are incapable of democracy and desirous of a strong leader. Tyranny, whether Tsarist autocracy, Soviet dictatorship, or Putin's presidency, thereby becomes the norm. So analyzing the conflict in Ukraine through the visor of preset national or ethnic categories also excludes other factors from consideration. As the historian Zbigniew emphasizes, the underlying tensions in eastern Ukraine, where Russian speakers dominate, and here I'll show you a map of kind of the language breakdown of Ukraine. Now, the tensions in eastern Ukraine are actually better understood in social, economic, and occupational terms. Economic stagnation, 2 decades of crony capitalism, and poor political leadership in Kiev have all combined to produce a festering resentment. And this resentment was activated by the political turmoil. And this included the removal of President Yanukovych, who was himself from eastern Ukraine and had his political base there. Now, paradoxically, perhaps, precisely these regions, these eastern regions with large Russian-speaking populations, were crucial to the successful establishment of the Ukrainian state in 1991. Many Russian speakers actively supported Ukrainian independence. What's important to remember here is that Ukrainian identity was not defined in national or ethnic terms, but in civic terms. In other words, as loyalty to one's state, not as loyalty to one's ethnic group. And so the founding of Ukraine was not actually a result of a strong national movement at all. It was a political result, largely due, in fact, to the collapse of the Soviet Union as a whole. Both paradigms of citizenship, what I call the civic paradigm and the national paradigm, continue to exist today, and both have highly relevant and important histories. Nevertheless, what we're seeing today is nationalist rhetoric playing on people's fears, as well as the actual experience of violence, helping to polarize national and regional identities, providing fertile soil for further radicalization. Okay, I want to turn now and talk a bit more about these national identities and affiliations. I mean, I am an historian, and so I'd like to chart them briefly as the product of often complex and even contradictory historical processes, which of course continue to exert an important presence today. Both Ukrainian and Russian identities are hybrid, contradictory, and very much in flux, reflecting a wide range of ideas about self and other, past and future, as well as the influence of what might gently be called nation-building projects, both historical and contemporary. Ukrainian and Russian identities are inextricably and complexly intertwined. So founded in 1991 amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine is one of the larger countries within Europe, possessing a Rust Belt-era industrial economy and fertile agricultural land. Though one of the world's younger states, It traces its history back over 1,000 years to medieval Kievan Rus. A paradox here is that Russia too traces its origins to medieval Kievan Rus via the Mongol evasion and the establishment of a new centralizing state in Muscovy. In other words, Russia and Ukraine share a common history of origins, albeit one that's kind of led along different paths. So nations often possess deep historical roots in specific places, languages, religions, and the like. And these roots are narrated in particular stories and myths that transmit values and bind national communities. Yet the very notion of the nation is a modern concept, largely a product of the French Revolution and German Romanticism. Radical new ideas about political sovereignty, that it should be vested in the people, not the monarch, thus combined with other new ideas privileging the primacy of ethnicity and the nation in defining people's identities. As these ideas spread over the 19th century, inspiring ethnographic investigations, the development of the modern discipline of history, revolutions, modern states began to claim their own legitimacy through their supposed national character. And as a result, they also began to institute nation-building projects. In other words, they're claiming their legitimacy based on being the representative of a nation, and often the people themselves need to be told about that affiliation. And what this means is that activists often sought to build national movements, including by combating what the historian Tara Zara calls national indifference. And that is, quite simply, the failure of most people to identify much with the nation at all, perceiving more commonality in other group identities, whether social, regional, religious, or linguistic. So in other words, nations didn't just exist. They were imagined, they were made, they were narrated, and sometimes they were mobilized. And that point, of course, is very relevant for today. This is all the more important in such diverse areas as Ukraine, where multiple religious and ethnic groups made their homes. And this includes, in just a partial list, Russian Orthodox Christians, what are called Uniate Christians, who share the Eastern Orthodox ritual but align with Rome, Polish Catholics, Jews, Armenians, Crimean Tatars, who are Muslims, Greeks, and so forth. So in some respects, the making of a Ukrainian nation followed a typical pattern. Over the course of the 19th century, intellectuals began to discover what would become Ukrainian language rather than dialect, folk customs, history, and culture. Key figures and ultimately symbols of the new nation included the poet and folklorist Taras Shevchenko, who is often credited with founding the Ukrainian literary language. Countless monuments to Shevchenko have been erected in his honor since 1991, actually often replacing previous monuments dedicated to Lenin. Now, by the early 20th century, in tandem with industrial development and urbanization, the spread of literacy and mass education, and the emergence of mass politics, ideas about Ukrainian national identity had spread widely. Yet here, geopolitical factors were crucial. The territory that now constitutes the modern state of Ukraine was part of two major empires, the Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire and the Russian Empire. And each of these had very different political and national cultures. Whereas the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a constitutional monarchy that allowed some political representation and public political expression, including for national minorities, the Russian Empire was an autocracy with a national project of its own. Now, peasants didn't really conceive their identity in terms of national identity. They were peasants first and foremost. Within the Russian part, this is very much the case. And in fact, there were peasant revolts in the early 20th century, which had nothing whatsoever really to do with Ukrainian issues at all. In the Western part, which was the part controlled by Austro-Hungary, here we had the development of a very strong sense of national identity. And this is currently also the center of, say, the national movement in modern Ukraine. Now, attempts to found a modern Ukrainian state foundered in the wake of World War I due to all sorts of reasons, including the Soviet Civil War. And Ukraine became a part of several countries following the end of hostilities, and that includes the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Romania. Now, in a manner that can only be described as paradoxical, the Soviet period was critical to the making of modern Ukraine. Marxism, of course, privileges the primacy of class identity and hence the principle of internationalism. Building on this basis, Vladimir Lenin argued not only that nationalism was a retrograde negative force, but that imperialism constitutes the highest form of capitalism. But the Bolsheviks had come to power in a multinational empire, and so Lenin was also very keen to counteract the legacies of great Russian nationalism within the boundaries of the Soviet Union. And he did this by pursuing policies that encouraged the development of national cultures, and he institutionalized them into the actual framework of the Soviet Union, which became what? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, most of them defined on national categories. Now, while policies varied over the course of Soviet history, and while other social and civic identities were also forged, including a very strong sense of Sovietness, it was in the Soviet period that the modern Ukrainian state was born. Terry Martin coined the influential term the affirmative action empire to describe how, in effect, the Soviet Union promoted the formation of all of these national identities. But now, if we look at modern Ukraine in the context of the Soviet Union, we see that the current boundaries were largely established in the wake of World War II, as the boundaries of Poland were pushed westward and formerly Habsburg lands were introduced into the current boundaries of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which of course became independent Ukraine in 1991. Now, whereas some of the countries of the former Soviet bloc have maintained close ties to Russia, others have not, and that is one of the core issues in today's conflict. Now, the 20th century did not treat the lands of Ukraine kindly, shall we say. It is part of what the historian Timothy Snyder calls the bloodlands, the geographical area between Hitler and Stalin, devastated not only by World War I, the Soviet Civil War, but also Stalinism, the purges, World War II. This is one of the centerpieces, of course, of the Eastern Front of World War II, post-war Sovietization, and so forth. So we have a whole series of disasters that took place within Ukrainian boundaries. And the devastation from all of these events and the human costs really cannot be overstated. But of particular note for our story today is Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture in the 1930s, which was effectively a war against the peasants, destroying their way of life and forcing them into factory farms. It hit the rich agricultural regions of Ukraine especially hard, and millions of people died in an artificial famine in the mid-1930s. This was used by the state to break resistance. Now, Ukrainians call this event the Holodomor, and many consider it a genocide. Though I should note, the famine hit many other regions of the Soviet Union as well. It was directed much more at peasants than as a national group. But for Ukrainians, it is perceived and understood and remembered in terms of a national genocide. Now, the aftermath of World War II is another key moment. And this was, of course, the moment when this part of Western Ukraine that had been not part of the Russian Empire was really fully annexed and integrated into the Soviet Union. And this includes the region around the really beautiful cosmopolitan city of Lviv. Now, basically, what historians have been looking at over the past couple of decades is that there is more or less a period of civil war. The nationalists were armed. This is in the aftermath of World War II, so there were lots of guns around. And there were pitched battles between Soviet force and the nationalists. And of course, Sovietization ultimately won, and tens of thousands of people were killed or deported to Siberia. This is another one of these national traumas that has been integrated into modern kind of Ukrainian consciousness, a crime against the Ukrainian people by Soviet/Russian people. And so this is again part of this ongoing process of making a narrative of Ukrainian history in which there are actually kind of key national actors and heroes and villains. And so I have been asked a very good question as well about why Putin is so interested in Ukraine in particular. Now, this is a very interesting question, and I'm sorry to say, to answer it requires another excursion into the 19th century, when in many respects the Russian national identity was also born. So here I have, to go along with Shevchenko, the Russian national poet, the father of the Russian literary language. This is Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, who died in a duel in 1837. So we have some commonalities. We have the kind of discovery of Russian folk culture, the development of a Russian literary language, again, kind of parallel in some respects to the Ukrainian story. But the Russian story is very different, in large part because Russia was a large land empire on the fringes of Europe. So while the new national histories that were also being kind of developed and written and propagated in this period dated the origins of the Russian nation to Kiev and Rus, modern Russia in fact spread out from Muscovy beginning in the 16th century and expanding thereafter to the west, south, and east. So Russian national identity and its relation to Ukraine cannot be understood without reference to its location on the fringes of Europe and its imperial character. So what do I mean, its location on the fringes of Europe? On the one hand, this is simply geographical. We all know Russia is to the east of Europe. Europe somehow is supposed to end, I believe, in the Urals mountains, and then Russia becomes part of Asia, so it straddles these two continents. But I want to talk about something a little bit different, which is about perceptions and cultural awareness. Is Russia part of Europe, or is Russia different? This is a long-standing debate, and I don't seek to answer it because there is not an answer. Russia is both and neither. What's important is that there was a very widespread perception among members of Russia's elites, of czars, the nobility, that Russia was backwards in relation to almost a mythologized, Western civilization, European civilization. And this perception shaped feelings of lack, of inadequacy, but also policies of modernization. One could cite Peter the Great in the early 18th century, whose forced westernization helped to transform Russia, in fact, into a European, superpower. Right? This is the beginning of Russia's entry into Europe. It also ended up creating Russia as one of the great leaders in international culture and science. We see that by the second half of the 19th century with Russian music, literature, painting, and science, as I said. We also see this kind of modernizing trend, this kind of fear that Russia was backwards in relation to Europe. In many other instances, it kind of prompted Tsar Alexander II to abolish serfdom and institute the Great Reforms, which he hoped also would modernize Russian society and allow Russia to maintain its status as a European power. Now, at the same time as we have this kind of dynamic, the sense of Russia needing to modernize, to move closer to Europe, we also see that Russian nationalism has drawn on very similar oppositions between Russia and the West, but instead to conceive and celebrate supposedly innate Russian qualities of character and culture, ones that were often deemed superior to what was considered the corruption and decadence of the West. Are secularism, egoism, materialism, and overriding fixation on self-interest. So Russian conservative nationalism took a whole range of forms. For example, Pan-Slavism, which portrayed the Russians as the natural leaders of all the Slavic and Orthodox peoples. So over the course of the 19th century, such ideas about the Russian nation, the specificities of the Russian national character, began increasingly to influence the actual governance of the Russian Empire. Rather than promoting a simple monarchical, or what I've called it in a different context, a more civic principle, demanding loyalty and service from all the Tsar's subjects, irrespective of ethnicity or nationality or language, the last two Tsars began to promote Russianness and ethnic Russians themselves as a means to bind and control the many ethnicities, nations, and peoples of the Russian Empire. So portraits of Tsar Alexander III for example, were designed to demonstrate his supposed national features. And these were, of course, strength, the Russian bear, right? Size, simplicity, directness, honesty, truth, as opposed to the kind of duplicity and artifice of the West. Now, of crucial importance was also his beard. He is the first Tsar since before Peter the Great to have a beard. And this is because Peter forced all the nobility to shave off their beards as part of his policy of Europeanization, okay? So having a beard was a way to align oneself with Russia, with the world of peasants or with the world of priests, who all did tend to have beards. Now, the autocracy also began to articulate new mythologies of Russian history that emphasized its roots in the period before Peter the Great, before Russia Europeanized. And this had all sorts of implications in terms of actual policies as well as, shall we say, cultural politics, the building of churches and monuments and public space throughout the empire. But to give one example of how this worked within the context of Ukraine, is that in 1888, the celebration of the 900 years since the conversion of Rus to Christianity included the dedication of this statue in Kiev to a 17th century Ukrainian leader who today is both a hero of Ukrainians and at times a hero of Russian imperial kind of allegiances. And the inscription, which was removed in the 1920s because it was much hated by the Ukrainians, celebrated the fraternal unity of Russia and Ukraine. And it said stuff like, "We want to be under the Tsar of Eastern Orthodoxy," and "A Russia, one and indivisible." So these kinds of monuments were very much articulations of cultural and political power. And yet, authoritarian rule combined with the policies of Russification and monuments such as these actually succeeded more in energizing a whole slew of national movements by the early 20th century. In other words, the whole policy really backfired. It likewise encouraged the spread of anti-Semitism and actually undermined the monarchy, which, as we all knew, fell to pieces in the midst of World War I and then, of course, the revolutions of 1917. Now, in the Soviet period following the revolutions, Great Russian nationalism would experience a real resurgence under Joseph Stalin, and it continued to dominate Soviet culture and institutions through the collapse of the empire. One expression of this is, of course, in another monument, which likewise celebrates the fraternal relations of Russia and Ukraine, which is the Arch to the Friendship of Peoples, which was dedicated in 1982 in Kiev. And there as well, we see the two figures, hand in hand, the one symbolizing Russia, the other Ukraine. So Ukraine continues to be a special case within Russian imperial history. Ukraine is, in effect, Russia's little brother, a notion quite literally inscribed in language. The term Little Russians denotes Ukrainians. That's how Russians would say, denote the area that is now Ukraine, alongside the Great Russians or the Russians, okay? And to this very day, if asked, many Russians don't perceive Ukrainians as a separate nationality at all. They are the Little Russians. Now, Putin has staked so much on Ukraine for several reasons, and some are very clearly strategic, and in no way do I want to kind of downplay these. As a land empire straddling Europe and Asia, Russia has repeatedly been invaded, and perceived encirclement by hostile powers remains a very real concern. As we likewise saw in the military conflict with the Republic of Georgia in 2008, he is seeking to keep former Soviet republics in Russia's sphere of influence, to hold back the expansion of NATO and the EU, which he perceives as direct threats to Russian interests and security. And perhaps he simply seeks to destabilize some of these border countries, which, of course, in my mind, is a very risky strategy indeed. But on another level, he is articulating a national and imperial vision for a domestic audience. Polling suggests that his annexation of Crimea was hugely popular. And over the last several years, his nationalist language has increased dramatically, partly in response to mounting economic problems, and partly, of course, in response to the emergence of significant movements of protest, which he has successfully suppressed thus far. This is also part and parcel of what you probably have also all heard about, which is his exploitation of socially conservative attitudes. One could cite the prosecution of Pussy Riot, the young women who protested in the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. They were considered to be also, violating the sanctity of the church, and the church is very integral to these kinds of conservative visions of Russian identity. Another policy that is receiving, quite rightly so, huge attention in the West is the criminalization of so-called homosexual propaganda. Now, what's important to understand here is that these kinds of socially and religiously conservative views are playing on the domestic audience, but also kind of evoking very familiar nationalist terms, that of Western decadence threatening Russian values. So homosexual propaganda and homosexuality becomes a Western phenomenon that is alien to Russia. So I want to suggest that all of these different kind of motifs are part of this broader, adaptation of a strongly kind of national language, something that we didn't see actually in his early years to this degree at all. At the same time, hosting prestige events such as the recent Winter Olympics in Sochi allows him an international stage on which to perform Russian national and imperial identity. Now, the Ukrainian-Russian writer Nikolai Gogol, so he was in the 19th century, and he can quite legitimately be included in the canon of both Ukrainian and Russian literature, famously described Russia as a troika. This is a horse-drawn sleigh, so with 3 horses generally. And the troika in Ukraine, in Gogol's words, is destined to surpass all other nations. Now, it is no accident at all that the troika formed the central motif in Russia's narrative of national history, which it presented in the opening ceremonies of the Sochi Games. Its meaning is best understood by going back to the original. Let me read the final lines of Gogol's novel, Dead Souls. Quote, "Russia, art thou too flying onwards like a spirited troika that nothing can overtake? Everything falls back and is left behind. The spectator stands still, struck dumb by the divine miracle. Is it not a flash of lightning from heaven? Everything there is on the earth is flying by, and the other states and nations, with looks askance, make way for her and draw aside." Even as Putin cultivates his public image as a strong national leader, shall we say he is driving the Russian troika, leaving all other nations behind, we might want to remember that the facts on the ground in both Russia and Ukraine are much more complex. Indeed, let's go back to Gogol, who is renowned for his satire, his inversions, his reversals, all of which form another strand of cultural history and cross-cultural fertilization that I have sorely neglected today. So I would like to close by highlighting dissent, not just by citing the latest protest, which just occurred a few days ago, but also within the sphere of culture. Now, a Google search will bring up many views of Putin, but if you put in very carefully ones such as Putin and Stalin, you begin to get very interesting things coming up. What you get are photoshopped images, done mostly by Russians, with a strong sense of history and satire. So here I've chosen a couple. We have him placed in a famous Stalinist poster as Stalin's lieutenant, okay? And then another one, which is a poster which is dedicated to Stalin, and it says, glory to the great Stalin. Somebody has scratched out Stalin and put Putin. So they are making fun of his aspirations to grandeur, to total power, and of course they can do it in today's Russia. I've also chosen another one, which is I really enjoyed, where Putin's head has been photoshopped into the uniform, a famous portrait of Peter the Great, okay? So this kind of laughter is also very critical, it's very subversive, and it's ultimately ironic. And in this way, it opens fresh perspectives on well-worn national myths and helps us to understand that these national stories are one important aspect of what is happening today, but that the reality on the ground is much more complex with multiple potentialities for its future development. So thank you very much.